Hello everyone, I hope you have watched all of my promise related videos, and here is a small challenge to test your understanding. So if you know JavaScript event loop and how the timers work, how promise works, you will be easily able to solve this question. So here we have a list of console.log statement. The only thing you have to do is that without executing this, try to predict the order of the console.log. So pause this video and try it by yourself, and then I will explain the solution. I hope you have got the right answer. So before executing this, let's try to understand what happens on each line. Okay. Now everything runs in the global context. So here on the right side, consider this as the JavaScript runtime in the browser. So we have the call stack, web APIs, running event loop, the microtask queue, and the macrotask queue. So everything here runs in the global environment. So once the execution start, a global execution context will be created and it will be pushed to the call stack. So the global execution context is pushed to the call stack. Now the first statement here is console.log start. So the console.log context will be created and pushed to the call stack. Now this immediately executes. Start will be printed. So we can write the output here. So start will be printed, and now the execution is completed, and this will be popped from the call stack. Now the next statement is a setTimeout function call. So a context of the setTimeout will be created and pushed to the call stack. Okay. Now the setTimeout function, this is an asynchronous function, and when it is invoked, the timer is registers with the timer registers with the web APIs, and the web API handles the setTimeout function. Okay. Now what happens here? So here you can see that the timer is running in 0 millisecond. So the callback is considered immediately. Okay, and the timer callback is handled through macrotask queue. So this callback will be pushed to the macrotask queue. So let's do that. So the callback is pushed to, even though I'm writing timer here, it's actually the whole callback. The reference of the callback is actually pushed to the macrotask queue, and the set timeout will be cleared from the call stack. Now, what is the next statement? Which is queueMicrotask. So a context of the queueMicrotask will be created, and it will be pushed to the call stack. Okay. Now the queueMicrotask context is pushed. Now what happens when queueMicrotask is executed? The callback that we passed to the queueMicrotask will be immediately pushed to the microtask queue. So here we have a callback. So this callback will be pushed to the microtask queue. So this callback now pushed to the microtask queue. Now queueMicrotask will be removed from the call stack. Okay. Now we have a promise.resolve static function, and to the returned promise we are calling the then method, and to that then method we are passing a callback. Okay, so the first one is promise.resolve static function. So the promise.resolve static function context will be created and will be pushed to the call stack. Okay, now what happens? Promise.resolve is executed. It immediately returns a fulfilled promise instance. So here the promise.resolve immediately returns a fulfilled promise instance to the global execution context, and this will be popped. Okay, now what happens to the returned promise instance? It is calling the then method. So the context of the then method will be created and pushed to the call stack. Okay, now what happens to that then method? We are giving a callback. Okay, now you know that the original promise instance is fulfilled already, so this callback is considered immediately. Now even though the promise is fulfilled, this callback is not executed synchronously. What happens here? This callback will be pushed to the microtask queue. So let's do that. Okay, now the then method immediately returns a promise instance to the global execution context, and this then will also be removed. Now what is here happening? Here we have a setTimeout function. So again, a setTimeout context will be created and pushed to the call stack. Okay, now the setTimeout will be registered with the web API, and the web API handles the timer. And what happens? So here you can see that here also the time is 0 millisecond. So the callback is immediately considered, and the callback will be pushed to the macrotask queue since this is timer. So timer callbacks are handled by macrotask. So here this callback will be pushed to the macrotask queue. So let's do that. Okay, now this is removed from the call stack. Now here you can see we are using the promise class and giving a callback function to the promise class. And inside that callback function, we are using a timeout, set timeout function call. And the set timeout function call runs in 0 millisecond. Okay. Now this promise class, I mean, this returns a promise instance. To that returned promise instance, we are calling the then method. Okay. So let's first consider the promise class. Here, the callback will be executed inside the constructor. So let's create a context for that. So let's do promise class. Okay, so the promise class context is added. Now this callback is executed immediately. Now what happens inside the callback? It is a set timeout function. So a set timeout context is created. Okay, now here in the set timeout, it also runs in 0 millisecond. So it registers with the web API and this is cleared. Okay, now inside the web API, what happens? You can see that this runs in 0 millisecond so that this callback will be pushed to the macro task queue. Okay, now here we can put timer inside promise, and the promise class returns a new promise instance which will be in the pending state because this callback should be executed, then only the promise instance returned from this constructor call will be in the fulfilled state. So currently it will be in the pending state. Okay, now this returns a promise instance and it will be returned to the global execution stack and this will be popped. Now here what happens to the returned promise instance, it is calling the then method, so a context of the then method will be created. Now to that then method, we are passing a callback function and the then method immediately returns a promise instance. Okay, so here in this case, since the original promise is in the pending state, this then method also returns a promise in this pending state, and this callback is considered later because the promise is in the pending state. So then returns a pending promise to the global execution stack, and this also will be popped from the call stack. Okay, now this callback is considered later once this particular callback is invoked. Now it comes to the last statement, which is console.log end. So console.log context will be created, and it immediately executes, and end will be printed. Okay, now this also will be removed. So there is nothing left in the left to execute in here. So the last statement is also executed. Now the global execution context is also removed. Now the call stack is empty. Now what happens? Now the event level checks. First it checks the call stack, so it sees the call stack is empty. Now it checks is there something left in the microtask queue. So out of this microtask and microtask queue have more priority. So it first checks the microtask queue. So the microtask queue having two callbacks, and the first inserted callback is this one, the microtask one from the queueMicrotask, which will be pushed to the call stack, which means the JavaScript runtime. So first it will be deleted from the uh, microtask queue, and the JavaScript runtime executes the callback. Okay, executes the callback, and the execution context will be pushed to the call stack. So this will be pushed to the call stack. So this is the callback actually. Okay, now what happens inside this callback? So inside this callback, a console.log is there. So a new context of the console.log will be created and pushed. So it says, okay, now it console.log immediately executes and it prints microtask here. Okay, so we have start, end, and microtask. Now this will be deleted. Now again, there is nothing left in the callback, so this will also be deleted from the call stack. Now again, even loop checks, is there something in the microtask queue since the call stack is empty? Now we have one more callback left in the microtask queue, so it is deleted from the microtask queue and the execution context will be pushed to the call stack. Now what we have here, so we have this callback here, and inside this callback we are using console.log. So a new context of the console.log is created and pushed to the call stack. Okay, so it immediately executes and it prints promise. Now this will be removed from the call stack. There is nothing left in the callback. So this is also removed. Again, call stack is empty and again checks. And here this time, the microtask queue is also empty. Now the event loop takes the first inserted item to the macrotask queue, which is this callback. So this callback from here will be moved to the call stack, which is this one from the set timeout. Okay, so this callback context is pushed, and inside this callback we are calling console.log. So a new context of the console.log will be created and it immediately executes and a timer will be printed. Okay, now this is popped and there is nothing left in the callback, so this will be also be popped. And again, call stack is empty, microtask queue is empty. Now macrotask queue have two items, so the first item will be taken care. Now the promise inside timer, so which is this callback here. Okay, so the on fulfilled callback, so promise inside timer. Now there is also a console.log, so okay, it immediately executes, so promise inside timer will be printed. Now what happens, this console.log is deleted and there is nothing left in the callback, so this is also deleted. Okay, now the call stack is empty, microtask queue is also empty, macrotask queue have one callback, which is this callback here. Okay, now this callback, what happens, this callback will be pushed to the call stack. Okay, now what is happening inside this callback, inside this callback the resolve function is executed, so a new context of the resolve function is created and we have the value timer inside promise, which uses the string and it calls the resolve function. So once the resolve is executed, what happens, the promise instance which is returned from this constructor call will be in the fulfilled state, and after that this execution context will be removed from the callback and there is nothing left in the callback, only the resolve function call, so this will also be removed. Okay, now what happens? Now the original promise instance is in the fulfilled state. Now we have a then call. Now this callback is now taking into action because like the now the original promise instance is in the fulfilled state. Now this callback, we need to execute this callback. But in this case also, since even though we don't have anything left, this is not executed synchronously. First, this callback will be inserted to the microtask queue. So here, so timer inside promise. So here this callback is pushed to the microtask queue. Okay, now the event loop checks call stack is empty and microtask queue we have one item, so this is pushed to the call stack. So here what happens, it gets the value and it will be passed to the console.log. So what is the value here, timer inside promise, and a new execution context of the console.log is created. Okay, now it immediately prints timer inside promise. Okay, now this will be removed, there is nothing left inside the callback, so this callback is empty. Now this is also removed. Now the call stack is empty, microtask queue is empty, and macrotask queue is empty. So the order of execution will be start, then end, then microtask from queueMicrotask, then promise here, then promise inside timer, timer inside promise. Okay, so let's execute this and see if our answer is correct. So you can see that start, then end, then microtask, then promise, then timer, which is the original timer, and then promise inside timer and timer inside promise. So I hope you have get some idea on how the event loop works, and I hope you enjoyed this challenge. Thank you for watching.